April 30th, 1863, 3:47 a.m. Camarón de Tejina, Mexico. The pre-dawn darkness couldn't hide Captain Jean d'Anjou's concern as he studied the faces of his 62 legionnaires and 3 officers gathered in the decrepit hacienda courtyard. Behind him, the walls of the abandoned farm compound rose barely 12 feet high, crumbling adobe that wouldn't stop determined rifle fire. Around them, 3 miles of flat Mexican scrubland offered no cover, no reinforcement, no escape. What d'Anjou didn't know, what none of his men could have imagined as they fortified their impossible position, was that they were about to fight the most lopsided battle in military history. Within 11 hours, these 65 French Foreign Legionnaires would face 3 full Mexican infantry battalions and 2 full cavalry squadrons, over 2,000 soldiers in the first assault alone. By day's end, more than 10,000 Mexican troops would rotate through the battle. The mathematics of annihilation seemed absolute, 150 to 1. No artillery support, no possibility of retreat, no hope of reinforcement. Every military manual ever written said the same thing: surrender immediately or die pointlessly. The Legionnaires chose a third option. They would show the world what 80 men could do when they refused to understand the word impossible. This is the story of how industrial-age warfare met pre-modern courage, how French military doctrine collided with Mexican determination, and how a wooden hand became the most sacred relic in military history. The French intervention in Mexico had begun with mathematical precision in 1861. Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte, had calculated that a weakened, civil war-torn Mexico represented easy imperial expansion. The United States, consumed by its own civil war, couldn't enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Conservative Mexican factions invited European intervention. The military operation seemed straightforward. What Napoleon III's planners hadn't calculated was that conquering a nation and occupying it were entirely different propositions. By April 1863, French forces controlled the coastal regions and major cities, but the 75 miles of road between Veracruz and the inland positions remained a nightmare corridor of ambushes, supply raids, and disappearances. The French Foreign Legion, formed in 1831 from foreign volunteers and military refugees, had been deployed specifically for this environment. These weren't conscripts or aristocratic officers playing at war. The Legion recruited men with nothing to lose: German deserters, Polish exiles, Swiss mercenaries, Italian revolutionaries, Spanish refugees. Men who had chosen a uniform over a noose, military service over starvation, the Legion's brutal discipline over whatever they were fleeing. Captain Jean d'Anjou exemplified the Legion's strange aristocracy of the damned. Born to wealth in 1828, he had volunteered for military service despite his social standing. An explosion in the Crimean War had destroyed his left hand in 1853. Rather than retire with honor and a pension, he commissioned an articulated wooden prosthetic and returned to active duty. By 1863, he commanded the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, Foreign Regiment, men who respected the wooden hand as a symbol of commitment that transcended mere patriotism. On April 29, 1863, Colonel Pierre Jeaningros received intelligence that a Mexican convoy carrying 3 million francs in gold was moving toward Puebla through the Legion's area of operations. He ordered d'Anjou to take a reinforced company, 65 men, and intercept it. The orders were clear: conduct a reconnaissance in force, locate the convoy, and harass its movement until reinforcements arrived. Standard colonial warfare. Danjou selected his best men, veterans of Algeria and Crimea, who understood that in counterinsurgency operations, speed and aggression mattered more than numbers. They departed from Chiquihuite at 1 a.m. on April 30th, moving through darkness to avoid the Mexican heat and reconnaissance. By 3 a.m., they had covered 15 miles. The men were tired but alert, their Minié rifles loaded, their 60 rounds of ammunition distributed in leather cartridge boxes. At 3:47 a.m., forward scouts reported movement ahead. Mexican cavalry. Lots of it. What Danjou's scouts had encountered was the vanguard of Colonel Francisco de Pola Mijan's force. 800 cavalry from the 8th Battalion and 1st and 6th Cavalry Squadrons, supported by 3 full infantry battalions totaling 1,200 men. Over 2,000 soldiers in the first assault alone. By day's end, more than 10,000 Mexican troops would rotate through the battle. The mathematics of annihilation seemed absolute. 150 to 1. No artillery support. No possibility of retreat, no hope of reinforcement. Every military manual ever written said the same thing: surrender immediately or die pointlessly. The legionnaires chose a third option. They would show the world what 80 men could do when they refused to understand the word impossible. This is the story of how industrial age warfare met pre-modern courage, how French military doctrine collided with Mexican determination, and how a wooden hand became the most sacred relic in military history. The French intervention in Mexico had begun with mathematical precision in 1861. Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte, had calculated that a weakened, civil war-torn Mexico represented easy imperial expansion. The United States, consumed by its own civil war, couldn't enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Conservative Mexican factions invited European intervention. The military operation seemed straightforward. What Napoleon III's planners hadn't calculated was that conquering a nation and occupying it were entirely different propositions. By April 1863, French forces controlled the coastal regions and major cities. But the 75 miles of road between Veracruz and the inland positions remained a nightmare corridor of ambushes, supply raids, and disappearances. The French Foreign Legion, formed in 1831 from foreign volunteers and military refugees, had been deployed specifically for this environment. These weren't conscripts or aristocratic officers playing at war. The Legion recruited men with nothing to lose: German deserters, Polish exiles, Swiss mercenaries, Italian revolutionaries, Spanish refugees, men who had chosen a uniform over a noose, military service over starvation, the Legion's brutal discipline over whatever they were fleeing. Captain Jean Danjou exemplified the Legion's strange aristocracy of the damned. Born to wealth in 1828, he had volunteered for military service despite his social standing. An explosion during the Crimean War had destroyed his left hand in 1853. Rather than retire with honor and a pension, he commissioned an articulated wooden prosthetic and returned to active duty. By 1863, he commanded the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, Foreign Regiment, men who respected the wooden hand as a symbol of commitment that transcended mere patriotism. On April 29, 1863, Colonel Pierre Geningro received intelligence that a Mexican convoy carrying 3 million francs in gold was moving toward Puebla through the Legion's area of operations. He ordered Danjou to take a reinforced company, 65 men, and intercept it. The orders were clear: conduct a reconnaissance in force, locate the convoy, and harass its movement until reinforcements arrived. Standard colonial warfare. Danjou selected his best men, veterans of Algeria and Crimea, who understood that in counterinsurgency operations, speed and aggression mattered more than numbers. They departed Chiquihuite at 1 a.m. on April 30th, moving through darkness to avoid the heat and reconnaissance. By 3 a.m., they had covered 15 miles. The men were tired but alert, their Minié rifles loaded, their 60 rounds of ammunition distributed in leather cartridge boxes. At 3:47 a.m., forward scouts reported movement ahead. Mexican cavalry. Lots of it. What Danjou's scouts had encountered was the vanguard of Colonel Francisco de Paula Milan's force, 800 cavalry from the 8th Battalion and 1st and 6th Cavalry Squadrons, supported by 3 full infantry battalions, totaling 1,200 men. Over 2,000 soldiers moving to reinforce Puebla against the French siege. Milan wasn't escorting gold. He was commanding a major troop movement, and he had just discovered 65 isolated French soldiers in the middle of his line of march. Danjou recognized the trap immediately. Open ground, no cover, enemy cavalry that could outflank and encircle in minutes. His men were exhausted from the night march, their muscles stiff, their reactions slowed. Running was suicide. The Mexican cavalry would ride them down in minutes. Standing to fight in the open was equally fatal. He spotted the hacienda ruins, 400 yards to the east, Camarón de Tejada, abandoned during the Civil War, its walls still standing despite years of neglect. Not a fortress, barely a defensible position, but the only option that wasn't immediate annihilation. A mí la Légion, to me the Legion. Danjou's order cut through the dawn silence. The legionnaires broke into a run, their equipment jangling, their boots pounding the hard-packed earth. Behind them, Mexican cavalry bugles sounded. The race was on. The hacienda walls were roughly rectangular, enclosing a courtyard approximately 50 yards by 70 yards. The adobe construction, deteriorated by weather and neglect, stood between 10 and 15 feet high. No roof remained over the interior structures. The main gate faced west, a wooden door that had long since rotted away. A smaller opening in the east wall provided the only other entrance. Danjou's men poured through the main gate at 4:15 a.m., with Mexican cavalry less than 200 yards behind them. The last man through, Corporal Philippe Maine, took a musket ball through his shoulder. He kept running, slamming the gate behind him as his squad mates dragged furniture and debris to barricade the opening. Sub-Lieutenant Jean Villin began organizing the interior defense, while Danjou climbed the wall to assess their position. What he saw confirmed his worst calculations. Mexican cavalry was forming up in all directions. Infantry columns were deploying from the south. They were surrounded by at least 800 men, with more arriving by the minute. The hacienda's defensive characteristics were barely adequate. The walls, while providing cover, had multiple breaches and weak points. The eastern gate couldn't be properly barricaded. The corner bastions had collapsed, leaving blind spots in their defensive perimeter. Worst of all, the compound had no water source. That last detail would prove more deadly than Mexican bullets. At 4:30 a.m., Colonel Milan sent a white flag forward. His terms were simple: immediate surrender, safe passage to Veracruz for all personnel, honor and arms returned. It was a generous offer by any military standard. The legionnaires were hopelessly outnumbered, isolated, and surrounded. Surrender was the only rational choice. Danjou assembled his officers in the courtyard. Sub-Lieutenant Villain, 23 years old, a veteran of Italy. Sub-Lieutenant Clement Maudet, 26, survivor of 3 colonial campaigns. Both men were exhausted, bleeding from minor wounds sustained during the retreat, and completely aware they were going to die. Danjou removed his wooden hand and held it up. The articulated fingers, crafted from Tonkin wood and brass joints, caught the first rays of dawn sunlight. "We will fight to the death rather than surrender," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. His officers nodded. There was no dramatic speech, no appeal to glory or honor. The Legion's code was simple: never abandon your dead, never surrender your colors, never break your oath. They had sworn to fight. They would fight. Villain returned to the Mexican lines with their response: "We have ammunition. We will not surrender." What happened next defied every principle of conventional military wisdom. Milan had expected immediate capitulation. Instead, he faced an enemy that preferred certain death to dishonor. It was, from a purely rational standpoint, incomprehensible. At 5 a.m., the first Mexican assault began. 800 cavalry dismounted and advanced as skirmishers, their Baker rifles and Brown Bess muskets cracking in ragged volleys. The legionnaires held their fire until the Mexicans reached 100 yards, then opened up with their Minié rifles in controlled volleys. The French rifle musket, adopted in 1857, used a revolutionary conical bullet that expanded on firing, gripping the barrel rifling and spinning for accuracy. Effective range, 500 yards. In the hands of trained soldiers, devastating. The Mexican first wave staggered under the concentrated fire. Men fell in clusters, their formations breaking. The survivors pulled back at 5:20 a.m., leaving approximately 60 dead and wounded in the scrubland. The legionnaires had suffered 3 wounded, none seriously. Milan studied the hacienda through his field glasses. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Their fire discipline was excellent, their marksmanship superior. They were conserving ammunition, rotating positions, and maintaining organized command structure. Professional soldiers, not colonial garrison troops. He ordered his infantry battalions forward. The second assault, at 6 a.m., involved 800 infantry supported by covering fire from dismounted cavalry. The Mexicans advanced in loose order, taking cover behind scrub vegetation and natural depressions. They reached the walls at 6:25 a.m. and attempted to scale them at multiple points simultaneously. The Legion's defense shifted to close quarters brutality. Legionnaires fired down into the climbing Mexicans, then used their rifles as clubs when the range closed to arm's length. Corporal Berg, a German deserter from the Prussian army, personally threw back 3 separate scaling attempts at the northeast corner before taking a musket ball through his jaw. By 7 a.m., the second assault had collapsed. Mexican casualties, approximately 120 killed and wounded. Legion casualties, 7 wounded, including Danjou himself, who took a ricochet fragment across his forehead that left him half-blinded by blood. Inside the hacienda, the legionnaires were discovering their most dangerous enemy wasn't Mexican bullets. The temperature was already exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The men had been marching since 1 a.m. without water. Their canteens had been emptied during the night march. The nearest water source was a creek 300 yards east, behind Mexican lines. Sub-Lieutenant Villain organized water collection from a small well discovered in the southeast corner. The well was barely 15 feet deep and nearly dry. It produced perhaps 5 gallons per hour, contaminated with sediment and debris. For 62 men fighting in Mexican heat while wearing wool uniforms and leather equipment, it was nowhere near enough. By 8 a.m., men were showing signs of heat exhaustion, cramping, disorientation, dark urine that came in painful, diminishing amounts. The wounded suffered worst. Blood loss combined with dehydration created a lethal synergy. Danjou rotated his men in shifts, half on the walls while half rested in whatever shade they could find. The morning sun turned the hacienda into an oven. The adobe walls radiated heat. The wool uniforms became torture devices. Men stripped to shirt sleeves, violating regulations they no longer cared about. At 9 a.m., Colonel Milan attempted negotiation again. Another white flag, another offer of surrender. This time, Milan emphasized practical reality. He had over 2,000 men now assembled, with another battalion arriving within the hour. The legionnaires were wounded, exhausted, and without water. Continued resistance was pointless. Danjou's response was delivered by Corporal Mon, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged. "We still have ammunition." The statement was technically true. Each legionnaire had started with 60 rounds. They had fired approximately 600 rounds total across the first two assaults. That left roughly 3,000 rounds remaining, distributed across 62 men. In purely mathematical terms, they could maintain their current rate of fire for perhaps 3 more major assaults. What the mathematics couldn't account for was heat, dehydration, exhaustion, and wounds. The legionnaires weren't machines. They were human beings approaching their physiological limits. At 10 a.m., the 3rd Mexican assault demonstrated Milan's growing frustration. He committed all 3 infantry battalions simultaneously, over 1,200 men, attacking from 3 directions while cavalry provided suppressing fire. The legionnaires faced a wall of advancing soldiers that stretched across their entire defensive perimeter. The volume of fire became overwhelming. Mexican muskets cracked in continuous volleys that chipped the adobe walls and sent fragments spraying across the courtyard. The legionnaires could barely maintain their positions under the barrage. Men were hit by ricochets that bounced off walls before finding flesh. The noise was stunning, thousands of individual reports merging into a continuous roar. Danjou moved along the walls, his wooden hand pointing directions, his voice cutting through the chaos. He repositioned men to threatened sectors, distributed the dwindling ammunition, and personally took over positions when wounded men fell back. Blood streamed down his face from his forehead wound. His uniform was dark with sweat and dirt. He looked like a scarecrow conducting an orchestra of death. The Mexican infantry reached the walls at 10:35 a.m. Legionnaires fired straight down into the climbing soldiers, their Minié rifles so hot that the wood stocks burned their hands. When ammunition ran low, they fired their officers' revolvers. When the revolvers emptied, they used their rifles as spears and clubs. Private Wenzel, a Polish deserter from the Austrian army, stood at the main gate firing methodically into the mass of Mexican soldiers trying to force the barricade. He fired his last rifle round at 10:47 a.m., drew his bayonet, and held the position alone for nearly 4 minutes before Mexican fire literally cut him in half. The 3rd Mexican assault broke at 11 a.m. Mexican casualties exceeded 200. The survivors pulled back, their formations shattered, their officers struggling to restore order. Colonel Milan was discovering what French commanders had known for 30 years. The Foreign Legion didn't retreat and didn't surrender. They simply fought until they died. Inside the hacienda, the situation had become critical. 18 legionnaires were wounded, 5 seriously. Ammunition reserves had fallen below 30 rounds per man. The midday heat exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were collapsing from dehydration, their bodies unable to cool themselves, their muscles cramping uncontrollably. Private Kunisek, the company bugler, attempted to drink from the contaminated well and vomited immediately. His body, already severely dehydrated, rejected the foul water. He returned to his position on the east wall and continued fighting, his hands shaking so badly he could barely reload his rifle. At 11:30 a.m., Danjou was struck by a Mexican musket ball while directing fire from the north wall. The round entered just below his left rib cage and exited near his spine. He fell backward, his wooden hand clattering on the stone courtyard. Blood spread rapidly across his uniform, dark and arterial. His men carried him to the shade of the interior wall. Sub-Lieutenant Villain took command, while Sub-Lieutenant Maudet knelt beside his captain. Danjou was conscious but fading rapidly. Internal bleeding, no possibility of surgical intervention. Minutes to live, maybe hours if he was unlucky. Danjou gripped Maudet's wrist with his remaining hand. His words were recorded by multiple survivors. "Promise me. Promise you won't surrender. Make them fight for every inch." Maudet promised. Danjou died at 12 p.m., exactly 8 hours after the first Mexican cavalry had appeared. His wooden hand remained in the courtyard where it had fallen, its articulated fingers still partially curled in his last gesture. Sub-Lieutenant Villain faced an impossible situation. 43 men still capable of fighting. Ammunition down to approximately 1,200 rounds total. No water beyond the contaminated well that made men sicker. Wounded requiring care they couldn't provide. Temperatures exceeding 105 degrees, and Mexican forces that now numbered over 3,000 men with more arriving. Any reasonable commander would have surrendered. The fight was over. They had demonstrated exceptional courage. No one could question their honor. Continued resistance was simply assisted suicide. Villain assembled his remaining officers and NCOs. The discussion lasted less than 3 minutes. They would continue fighting. Not because they expected to win, not because they expected rescue, but because Captain Danjou had asked them to, and in the Legion, a promise to a dying officer was absolute. At 1 p.m., Colonel Millan committed his reserves, 2 fresh infantry battalions that had just arrived from Soledad, over 1,000 men who hadn't participated in the morning's slaughter. This wasn't a tactical assault, this was extermination. Millan had lost nearly 400 men trying to take a ruined hacienda from 65 legionnaires. He was done negotiating. The fourth assault was systematic annihilation. Mexican infantry advanced behind a screen of skirmishers that kept the legionnaires pinned while main assault columns positioned themselves. When they attacked at 1:30 p.m., they came from all directions simultaneously with overwhelming force. The legionnaires' defensive perimeter collapsed within 15 minutes. Mexican soldiers poured through the breached east wall while others scaled the weakened north section. The fighting descended into savage close-quarters combat in the hacienda courtyard. Sub-Lieutenant Maudet organized a fighting withdrawal to the main building's interior, a roofless rectangular structure approximately 30 by 40 feet. 23 legionnaires made it inside. The rest, dead, wounded, or cut off, fell where they fought. Private Cateau, a Belgian former coal miner, held the east wall alone for nearly 8 minutes after his squad was killed. He fired his last rounds at point-blank range into the attacking Mexicans, then charged into their ranks with his bayonet. Mexican soldiers later reported finding him dead beneath 5 of their own men. By 2 p.m., only 19 legionnaires remained alive in the main building. They barricaded the doorways with furniture and corpses, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their physical condition approaching complete collapse. Some men could no longer stand, others were delirious from heat stroke and dehydration. Sub-Lieutenant Villain was shot through both legs. He directed the defense while lying against the wall, his blood pooling on the floor. Corporal Maine, wounded in the shoulder during the initial retreat, had been hit twice more. He continued loading rifles for men too weak to manage it themselves. At 3 p.m., a Mexican shell, likely from a small mountain gun that had been brought forward, struck the main building's wall. The adobe exploded, sending fragments through the interior. 3 legionnaires died instantly. 2 more were wounded so severely they couldn't continue fighting. 14 men remained combat effective. Their ammunition had fallen to approximately 10 rounds per man. The afternoon heat had exceeded 110 degrees. Men were hallucinating, their bodies shutting down from catastrophic dehydration. At 4 p.m., the Mexican infantry prepared for their final assault. Over 1,000 soldiers surrounded the main building, their commanders organizing them for a simultaneous rush from all directions. There would be no survivors, no prisoners, just ending this insane resistance that had cost Mexico over 500 casualties. Inside the building, Sub-Lieutenant Villain made his final dispositions. He divided the remaining ammunition equally, 7 rounds per man. When those were gone, they would fix bayonets and charge. No surrender. No quarter asked or expected. The Legion way. At 4:45 p.m., the Mexican final assault began. 1,000 soldiers advanced against 14 men. The legionnaires fired their remaining ammunition in careful, aimed shots that dropped Mexican soldiers with mechanical precision. When the rifles emptied at 4:52 p.m., the legionnaires fixed bayonets. 12 men remained standing. Sub-Lieutenant Delane, unable to stand on his shattered legs, propped himself against the wall with his revolver. Sub-Lieutenant Maudet formed the survivors into a rough line. Corporal Main, Corporal Berg, Private Wenzel, Private Kunasik, Private Cateau, men whose names should be remembered alongside Thermopylae and Alamo. They charged. 12 exhausted, wounded, dehydrated men charged into 1,000 Mexican soldiers. Not because they believed they would survive, not because they expected to win, but because the alternative was surrender, and legionnaires don't surrender. The charge lasted less than 20 seconds. Mexican fire cut down most of the legionnaires within the first few steps. Sub-Lieutenant Maudet fell with 7 bullets in his body. Corporal Main took a musket ball through his chest and continued forward 3 more steps before collapsing. Corporal Berg reached the Mexican line and killed 2 soldiers with his bayonet before being shot down. At 5 p.m., the firing stopped. The silence was sudden and shocking. 5 legionnaires remained alive. Corporal Main, Privates Wenzel, Cateau, Constantine, and Leonhard. All were wounded. All were surrounded by hundreds of Mexican soldiers. They formed a tight circle, their bayonets outward, prepared to die. A Mexican officer, later identified as Captain Brasseau of the infantry, stepped forward with raised hand. "Surrender," he called in French. "You have fought enough." Corporal Main's response entered Legion legend. "We will surrender if you allow us to keep our weapons and care for our wounded." The audacity was breathtaking. 5 wounded men, surrounded by an entire army, were negotiating terms. Colonel Milan, who had arrived to witness the final moments, reportedly laughed, not in mockery, but in genuine amazement. He looked at the hacienda, its walls pockmarked by thousands of bullets, its courtyard littered with dead from both sides, its defenders reduced to 5 barely standing soldiers who still refused to simply quit. "No," Milan replied, "men like you refuse nothing. You have earned your weapons." The 5 survivors were allowed to retain their rifles. Mexican soldiers provided water and medical care. The wounded retreated with respect that approached reverence. These weren't defeated soldiers. They were something else entirely, something that transcended nationality or cause. The body count told the story of the impossible. 65 legionnaires had held a ruined hacienda for over 11 hours against Mexican forces that eventually numbered over 10,000 rotating troops. Of the 65 legionnaires, 23 were killed in action. 31 were wounded, 5 of whom died later from their injuries. Only 6 were captured completely uninjured. Mexican casualties were never definitively established. Contemporary reports ranged from 300 to over 600 killed, with wounded numbers perhaps double that. Modern historians generally estimate approximately 500 Mexican soldiers killed and 1,000 to 1,500 wounded. Colonel Milan's command lost roughly 20 to 25% casualties attempting to overwhelm a force less than 3% of their size. The mathematics defied military science. A 100-to-1 numerical advantage should have resulted in total victory within hours. Instead, it took all day and cost Mexico more casualties than most conventional battles. Captain Danjou's wooden hand was recovered from the courtyard by a Mexican officer who recognized its significance. He returned it to French authorities under flag of truce. Today, it resides in the French Foreign Legion Museum at Aubagne, displayed in a glass case and paraded annually on April 30th during Camerone Day celebrations. It is the Legion's most sacred relic, more revered than battle flags or regimental colors. The political and strategic impact of Camerone proved negligible. The French intervention in Mexico continued until 1867, when French forces withdrew under American pressure following the end of the U.S. Civil War. Emperor Maximilian Charles I of Mexico, the Austrian Archduke France had installed as Mexican emperor, was executed by firing squad. Napoleon III's imperial ambitions in Mexico ended in complete failure. But militarily and psychologically, Camerone achieved something profound. It demonstrated that courage, discipline, and professional skill could temporarily overcome any numerical disadvantage. That 65 men with sufficient motivation could hold off an army. That surrender, while rational, wasn't inevitable. The battle established the French Foreign Legion's reputation for suicidal bravery that continues today. Camerone became the defining moment of Legion identity, the standard against which all subsequent actions would be measured. Every Legionnaire, regardless of nationality or background, learns the story in excruciating detail during basic training. The Mexican soldiers who fought at Camerone developed a grudging respect that bordered on awe. Captain Bressot, who offered the final surrender terms, wrote in his memoirs, "We fought men possessed by devils or guided by angels. They should have died in the first hour. They fought for 11. We won the battle, but lost the encounter. They proved that will matters more than numbers." The tactical lessons were studied by military academies worldwide. Camerone demonstrated that properly positioned infantry with modern rifles could exact catastrophic casualties from numerically superior forces. It validated defensive tactics that would dominate warfare for the next 50 years. It showed that morale and training could compensate for technological or numerical disadvantage. But perhaps most significantly, Camerone revealed the limits of rational military calculation. Every staff officer analyzing the battle reached the same conclusion. The Legionnaires should have surrendered at 5 a.m. when first surrounded. Continued resistance was militarily pointless. They couldn't win, they couldn't escape, they couldn't even delay Mexican forces significantly. Yet they fought anyway, not because they miscalculated their chances, not because they believed rescue was coming, but because they had promised to fight, and Legion promises were absolute. It was, from any practical standpoint, insane, but it was also magnificent. In the years following Camerone, the French Foreign Legion compiled a combat record that defied statistical probability. In Algeria, Morocco, Indochina, and dozens of forgotten colonial conflicts, Legion units repeatedly fought to annihilation rather than surrender. The casualty rates were staggering. In some campaigns, Legion battalions suffered 80 to 90% casualties while inflicting disproportionate damage on numerically superior enemies. The German army, studying Legion tactics before World War I, concluded that Legionnaires were dangerously insane and recommended avoiding direct combat with Legion units whenever possible. Japanese forces in Indochina developed similar assessments. The Viet Minh, despite defeating France in 1954, treated captured Legionnaires with extreme caution. These were men who had demonstrated they preferred death to dishonor. The Mexican government, in a remarkable gesture of military respect, erected a monument at the Camarón battlefield in 1892. The inscription, approved by President Porfirio Diaz himself, reads, "There were less than 60 opposed to a whole army. Its mass crushed them. Life rather than courage abandoned these soldiers of France." The French Foreign Legion's official motto, Legio Patria Nostra, "The Legion is our country," captures the psychology that made Camarón possible. These weren't men fighting for nationalism or political ideology. They were fighting for each other, for their unit, for the code that had given them identity when their own nations had rejected them. Modern military psychologists studying Camarón have identified it as a near-perfect example of unit cohesion overcoming impossible odds. The legionnaires weren't individually superhuman. Medical examinations of the survivors revealed ordinary men, no exceptional physical capabilities, no unusual genetic advantages. What they possessed was training so thorough it became instinct, discipline so ingrained it survived the collapse of rational thought, and loyalty to comrades that transcended self-preservation. At the 150th anniversary commemoration in 2013, French President François Hollande noted, "Camarón teaches us that there are circumstances where courage consists not in hoping to win, but in refusing to lose. The legionnaires knew they would die. They chose how they would die." The battle's influence extends beyond military circles. Camarón has become a touchstone for discussions of duty, sacrifice, and the limits of human endurance. Philosophers reference it when discussing existential courage. Historians cite it as evidence that individual agency can temporarily triumph over deterministic material forces. Psychologists study it to understand peak performance under catastrophic stress. The 5 survivors, Corporal Maine, Privates Wenzel, Cattau, Constantin, and Leonhard, lived remarkably varied lives after Camarón. Maine recovered from his wounds and served another 15 years in the Legion, eventually retiring as a sergeant major. Wenzel deserted in 1865, disillusioned by France's continued intervention in Mexico. Cattau died of yellow fever in 1867. Constantin and Leonhard both survived the war and returned to civilian life in Europe, their Legion service providing them with pensions and the respect that had eluded them in their original countries. None of them ever claimed to be heroes. In interviews conducted decades later, they consistently described Camarón as simply doing their duty. They hadn't made a conscious choice to sacrifice themselves. They had followed orders, maintained their training, and survived through a combination of skill and luck. The heroism, they insisted, belonged to the 23 men who died. The Mexican soldiers who participated in the battle carried their own complicated memories. Many expressed admiration for the legionnaires' courage, while questioning the rationality of their sacrifice. Some felt guilt for the casualties inflicted on men they had come to respect. Others simply acknowledged that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Ordinary men transformed by circumstance and commitment into something approaching mythology. The hacienda at Camarón de Tegueda still stands, partially restored as a historical monument. Visitors can walk the compound where 65 men held off an army. The walls still show bullet impacts. The courtyard where Danjou died is marked with a plaque. Mexican and French veterans organizations jointly maintain the site, a rare example of former enemies cooperating to preserve shared military heritage. Every April 30th, French Foreign Legion units worldwide conduct Camarón Day ceremonies. The wooden hand is paraded before assembled legionnaires. The battle is recounted in excruciating detail: names, numbers, timeline. Young recruits stand at attention, learning that the Legion's identity isn't built on victories, but on refusal to accept defeat. The ceremony always ends with the same declaration: "Red information." In remembering this glorious day, every legionnaire, knows he is the inheritor of a tradition that makes no distinctions between accomplishing the mission or sacrificing one's life in its execution. It is, by any modern standard, a disturbing message. It explicitly values mission completion over survival. It celebrates death over surrender. It suggests that rational self-preservation is less important than abstract honor. Yet it resonates. Legion recruitment has never struggled. Thousands of men annually volunteer for service that offers harsh conditions, brutal discipline, low pay, and high casualty rates. They come from dozens of countries, fleeing dozens of different circumstances, seeking something their birth nations couldn't provide. What they find is Cameroon, the promise that courage matters, that 65 men can hold off 10,000 if they simply refuse to quit, that dying well is better than living poorly, that somewhere in this world there's still an organization that values duty over comfort, honor over survival, brotherhood over self-interest. The final accounting of Cameroon remains mathematically impossible. 65 men inflicted approximately 500 to 600 casualties while suffering 23 killed and 31 wounded. A casualty exchange ratio of roughly 10 to 1 in favor of the vastly outnumbered force. Every military principle says this can't happen. Every staff calculation proves it's impossible. The wooden hand in its glass case offers the only explanation that matters. Captain Donjau's prosthetic, with its articulated fingers and brass joints, represents the transformation of disability into symbol, of weakness into strength, of individual limitation into collective transcendence. On April 30th, 1863, at a forgotten hacienda in Mexico, 65 men who had nothing left to lose discovered they had everything to defend. They couldn't win. They couldn't escape. They couldn't even significantly delay the Mexican forces, but they could choose how their story ended. The Mexicans won the battle. The French lost the war. But 160 years later, we still remember Cameroon. Not because 65 men defeated 10,000, but because 65 men refused to understand why they couldn't. The thunder that day wasn't artillery. It was the sound of impossible mathematics colliding with absolute commitment. The silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was the world trying to understand what it had witnessed. At Aubagne, the wooden hand rests in its case. The brass joints still articulate. The wooden fingers still curl. And every year, another generation of legionnaires stands before it and learns the only lesson that matters. Courage isn't believing you'll win. Courage is fighting anyway. The wooden hand tells only part of the story. To understand what happened at Cameroon requires understanding what the French Foreign Legion had become by 1863, and why 65 men could transform a military disaster into legendary victory through sheer refusal to acknowledge reality. The Legion's recruitment process in the 1860s was brutally simple. Present yourself at a recruiting station, provide a name, any name, real or invented, swear an oath to serve France for 5 years. That was it. No background checks, no questions about your past. The Legion didn't care if you were a criminal, deserter, bankrupt aristocrat, or political refugee. They cared only whether you could march, shoot, and obey orders. This produced a unique military culture. A German corporal might command a squad of Italians, Poles, and Spaniards who shared no common language beyond military French. A former banker might share a tent with a former smuggler. Political revolutionaries slept beside monarchist exiles. The only identity that mattered was legionnaire. The training regime reflected this radical egalitarianism. Every recruit, regardless of previous military experience or social status, began at zero. The instructors, almost exclusively Legion veterans, applied discipline that would have caused mutinies in conventional units. 20-mile forced marches in full equipment, bayonet drill until hands bled, rifle practice that consumed ammunition lavishly by colonial standards, 150 rounds per man monthly, far exceeding most European armies. But the real training was psychological. Instructors systematically broke down national identities and rebuilt Legion identity. You weren't German or Polish or Italian anymore. You were a legionnaire. Your country was the Legion. Your family was your company. Your honor was collective, not individual. This wasn't patriotic rhetoric. It was systematic psychological reconstruction. By 1863, the Legion had been practicing this transformation for 32 years across dozens of colonial conflicts. They had learned what worked. The men who assembled at Cameroon on April 30th weren't random soldiers. They were products of the most intensive small unit training in the world. Captain Donju's company exemplified this refinement. His 62 enlisted men represented 14 nationalities. The breakdown, reconstructed from muster rolls, 28 French, mostly Alsatians, and men fleeing criminal records, 12 Germans, deserters from various German states, 8 Italians, political refugees from failed 1848 revolutions, 6 Polish, survivors of failed uprisings against Russia, 3 Spanish, 2 Swiss, 1 Belgian, 1 Dutch, and 1 Austrian. The average age was 27, average Legion service 4.3 years. These were veterans. More significantly, 47 of the 62 had combat experience. 18 had fought in the Crimean War. 23 had served in Algeria's endless pacification campaigns. 6 had participated in the Italian War of Independence. They knew what bullets sounded like, what dying men looked like, what combat did to human bodies and minds. The weapons they carried reflected French military innovation. The Minié rifle musket, formerly designated the Fusil d'Infanterie Model 1857, represented the cutting edge of infantry firepower. The weapon used a revolutionary system, a conical bullet with a hollow base that expanded upon firing, gripping the barrel's rifled grooves and spinning for accuracy. The technical specifications mattered enormously at Cameroon. Caliber 17.8 millimeters, or .702 inches. Barrel length 1,029 millimeters, or 40.5 inches. Weight 4.45 kilograms, or 9.8 pounds, loaded. Effective range 500 yards against individual targets, 800 yards against formation targets. Rate of fire in trained hands 3 to 4 rounds per minute, sustained, 5 rounds for short periods. Each Legionnaire carried 60 rounds in leather cartridge boxes, 40 in the primary box on the right hip, 20 in a supplementary box on the left. The paper cartridges contained both powder charge and Minié ball in a single package. Loading procedure: bite open the paper cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, insert the Minié ball, ram it home with the steel ramrod, place a percussion cap on the nipple, cock the hammer, aim, fire. In combat conditions with adrenaline and exhaustion, even experienced soldiers needed 15 to 20 seconds per shot. The mathematics of ammunition consumption at Cameroon were brutal. 62 men with 60 rounds each, 3,720 rounds total. By the time the final charge occurred at 5 p.m., the Legionnaires had been firing for approximately 11 hours. They had faced at least 6 major assaults and maintained suppressive fire during the intervals. Surviving ammunition counts suggest they fired approximately 3,500 rounds, over 90% of their total supply. This meant Legionnaires fired an average of 55 rounds per man over 11 hours, approximately 1 shot every 12 minutes. But combat doesn't work on averages. Assaults concentrated fire into intense bursts. During the 6 a.m. assault, legionnaires likely fired 10 to 15 rounds in 20 minutes. During lulls, they might fire only 2 to 3 rounds per hour for harassment. The discipline required to maintain this fire distribution while exhausted, dehydrated, and dying was extraordinary. The Mexican forces faced their own ammunition challenges. The bulk of Milan's infantry carried British Brown Bess muskets, smooth-bore weapons dating to the Napoleonic Wars with effective ranges barely exceeding 100 yards. Better-equipped units had Baker rifles or French Charleville muskets captured during earlier conflicts. A minority carried more modern weapons, perhaps 200 to 300 men with rifled muskets comparable to the French Minié. This created a devastating range advantage for the legionnaires. Mexican soldiers had to close within 100 yards to have reasonable hit probability. The legionnaires could engage effectively at 300 to 400 yards. This meant Mexican infantry had to cross 200 to 300 yards of killing zone under accurate fire before they could effectively return it. The casualty differential reflected this technological gap. Analysis of Mexican casualty reports, incomplete and politically sanitized, suggests approximately 60% of Mexican casualties occurred beyond 150 yards, killed or wounded before they could effectively engage. The legionnaires' superior weapons and training created a mathematical meat grinder. But weapons alone don't explain Cameroon. The Battle of Waterloo, fought 48 years earlier, had demonstrated that even Napoleon's veterans could be overwhelmed by sufficient numerical superiority. What made Cameroon different was the hacienda itself and how the legionnaires used it. The hacienda Cameroon, the Takeda, was never intended as a military fortification. Built in the early 1800s as an agricultural compound, it had been designed to process sugarcane and provide basic security against bandits. The walls, constructed from adobe bricks, mud mixed with straw and dried in the Mexican sun, were approximately 20 to 24 inches thick, strong enough to stop musket balls at moderate range, but vulnerable to sustained fire or artillery. The compound's layout created both advantages and fatal weaknesses. The rectangular perimeter measured approximately 50 yards by 70 yards, enclosing roughly 3,500 square yards, about 3/4 of an American football field. This was simultaneously too large to defend with 62 men and too small to provide maneuver room or fallback positions. The walls varied in height from 10 feet at the lowest points to perhaps 15 feet at the corners. Deterioration from weather and neglect had created numerous weak spots, cracks, crumbling sections, and areas where the adobe had eroded to less than a foot thick. The legionnaires spent their first hour frantically reinforcing these weak points with furniture, timber, and debris. The main gate on the west wall was the primary defensive challenge. The original wooden doors had rotted away years earlier, leaving a 10-foot wide opening. The legionnaires barricaded it with everything available: broken furniture, timber beams, farm equipment, even dead horses from the initial skirmish. The resulting barrier was barely 4 feet high and wouldn't stop a determined assault. The eastern wall featured a smaller service entrance, perhaps 5 feet wide. This proved impossible to properly secure. No materials were available, and men were needed on the defensive perimeter. The legionnaires blocked it with a cart and some barrels, but everyone knew it represented a fatal vulnerability. Inside the compound, 3 roofless structures provided minimal cover. The main building, where the final stand occurred, measured roughly 30 by 40 feet, with walls approximately 10 feet high. 2 smaller outbuildings, both partially collapsed, offered some protection, but not enough for tactical value. The bulk of the compound was open courtyard, exposed ground where Mexican fire could reach anyone not pressed against the walls. The well that provided their contaminated water was located in the southeast corner, the furthest point from the main gate and closest to Mexican positions. Reaching it required exposing yourself to enemy fire. By mid-morning, the area around the well was so heavily targeted that men drawing water had approximately 50% chance of being hit. Danjur's defensive organization reflected professional military thinking adapted to desperate circumstances. He divided his force into 4 sections of 15 to 16 men each, assigning 1 section to each wall. Officers rotated among all positions, providing leadership and tactical flexibility. A small reserve, never more than 8 men, remained in the center courtyard to reinforce threatened sectors and evacuate wounded. The disciplined cornet ordered, controlled volleys rather than individual fire. When a Mexican assault developed, section leaders would call volleys, ready, present, fire. 15 rifles firing simultaneously created a wall of lead that staggered attacking formations. Between volleys, designated marksmen engaged individual targets, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect. This discipline held through the first 3 assaults, but by 10 a.m., with Danju wounded and ammunition dwindling, the system began breaking down. Men fired individually as targets appeared. The careful ammunition conservation gave way to desperate volume. The transformation from disciplined defense to survival fighting had begun. The heat was killing them as surely as Mexican bullets. The Mexican climate in late April is brutally hot. Temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. Combined with 70–80% humidity from the nearby Gulf of Mexico, the heat index approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. For men wearing wool uniforms, leather equipment, and fighting for their lives, these conditions were catastrophic. Human thermoregulation fails in predictable stages. Stage 1, heavy sweating, increased heart rate, mild fatigue. By 7 a.m., every legionnaire was in Stage 1. Stage 2, profuse sweating stops as the body becomes dehydrated. Core temperature rises above 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Cognitive function begins degrading. By 9 a.m., most men had progressed to Stage 2. Stage 3 is heat exhaustion. Core temperature above 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Inability to sweat, confusion, muscle cramps, potential loss of consciousness. By 11 a.m., at least 15 legionnaires were experiencing Stage 3 symptoms. Several had collapsed at their positions. Others were hallucinating, seeing water that didn't exist, hearing orders that weren't given, forgetting where they were. Stage 4 is heat stroke. Core temperature above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Complete system failure, seizures, loss of consciousness, death. The 5 legionnaires who died from wounds but might have survived with proper care were likely pushed over the edge by heat stroke. Their bodies, already stressed by trauma and blood loss, simply couldn't maintain core functions at those temperatures. The contaminated well made everything worse. The water contained sediment, animal waste, decomposition products from organic matter, and likely bacterial contamination. Under normal circumstances, you'd boil it or avoid it entirely. But desperate men drank it anyway, and many immediately vomited, losing more fluid than they gained. Private Kunisek, the bugler, exemplified the heat's impact. At 6 a.m., he was functioning normally, firing, reloading, following orders. By 10 a.m., he was moving slowly, his reactions delayed. By noon, he was barely conscious, propped against the wall, unable to reload his own rifle. He continued fighting by accepting loaded weapons from wounded men who couldn't stand, firing them, then passing them back for reloading. By 2 p.m., he was hallucinating, calling for his mother in German. He died during the final assault, shot through the head while attempting to charge Mexican positions he apparently thought were his family's farm in Bavaria. The wounded suffered worst. Corporal Berg, shot through the jaw during the 6 a.m. assault, couldn't drink water. It poured out through the hole in his face. He continued fighting for 6 more hours, bleeding, unable to communicate, his body temperature climbing uncontrollably. He collapsed at 1 p.m. and died at 2:30 p.m., not from his wound, but from heat stroke combined with shock and blood loss. The Mexican soldiers, while better acclimated to the heat, faced their own challenges. They had water sources outside the hacienda, but accessing them meant withdrawing from assault positions. Their dark wool uniforms, while lighter than the French, still trapped heat. And unlike the legionnaires who could remain stationary on the walls, Mexican infantry had to cross open ground under fire, heavy exertion that accelerated dehydration. Mexican casualty reports mentioned dozens of soldiers collapsing from heat during the assaults. Some died from heat stroke before they ever reached the hacienda walls. Others became disoriented and wandered into friendly fire. The combination of heat, fear, and exhaustion degraded Mexican effectiveness as surely as it degraded the legionnaires. Colonel Milan faced a command problem unprecedented in his experience. He had overwhelming numerical superiority. By 1 p.m., he commanded over 3,000 soldiers against fewer than 50 legionnaires. He had adequate ammunition, water, and medical support. His men were trained soldiers, not militia. Every military principle said he should have ended this fight hours ago. But every assault was bleeding him white. His officers reported that men were refusing to participate in subsequent assaults after surviving the first one. The psychological impact of watching their comrades shot down while crossing open ground, seeing the French rifles fire with mechanical precision, hearing the screams of wounded dying in the sun, it was breaking Mexican morale. Milan's tactical reports, captured after the war, revealed his frustration. He tried massing forces for overwhelming assaults. The legionnaires concentrated fire on the densest formations. He tried dispersed skirmisher tactics. The French marksmen picked off individual soldiers. He tried simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The legionnaires had interior lines and could shift forces faster than his exterior forces could coordinate. He even tried waiting them out, hoping heat and thirst would force surrender, but the legionnaires kept firing, kept refusing surrender offers, kept demonstrating that they would die before yielding. By 2 p.m., Milan was facing a strategic crisis. His command had suffered approximately 500 casualties. His men's morale was deteriorating. His superiors would demand explanations for why it took an entire day and thousands of soldiers to overwhelm 65 men in a ruined hacienda. The longer this continued, the more it looked like incompetence rather than enemy tenacity. His decision to commit his remaining reserves in a final overwhelming assault was as much political as military. He needed this ended. He needed the legionnaires dead or captured. He needed to stop the bleeding, literally and figuratively. The final assault at 1:30 p.m. employed over 1,200 soldiers, roughly 20 men for every remaining legionnaire. The plan was simple: attack from all directions simultaneously with such overwhelming force that the defenders couldn't concentrate fire, accept the casualties, end the fight, restore order. The assault succeeded militarily, but failed psychologically. Yes, Mexican forces overran the hacienda. Yes, they killed or captured every remaining legionnaire. But it took another 3 hours and cost another 150 casualties. And the final image, 5 wounded men charging into an army with empty rifles and fixed bayonets, became more powerful than any Mexican victory. Captain Brasso, the Mexican officer who received the final surrender, understood this immediately. His memoirs, written 20 years later, captured the paradox. We won every tactical engagement. We killed or wounded 90% of their force. We held the field. But somehow we had lost. They had proven that courage and discipline could resist any numerical superiority. that 65 men could hold off thousands if they simply refused to quit. Every soldier in Mexico that day understood we had witnessed something that transcended victory or defeat. The aftermath of Cameroon created ripples that extended far beyond one battle in rural Mexico. The Mexican government's decision to return Danjo's wooden hand to French authorities was unprecedented. Military equipment captured in battle traditionally became spoils, but Mexican officers recognized that the wooden hand had transcended military equipment. It had become a symbol of something larger. The French Legion Foreign Legion transformed Cameroon into the foundational myth of their identity. Before 1863, the Legion was simply another colonial military unit, effective but not legendary. After Cameroon, it became something else, the regiment that preferred death to dishonor, that fought to annihilation rather than surrender, that made the impossible routine. This wasn't accidental. French military authorities recognized the propaganda value immediately. While France was losing the Mexican intervention militarily and politically, Cameroon provided a narrative of courage that obscured strategic failure. The Legion became the symbol of French military virtue, even as French policy proved disastrous. The Legion formalized this mythology with ruthless efficiency. Cameroon Day became the Legion's most important celebration, superseding even Bastille Day. Every Legionnaire memorizes the battle's details during basic training: names, timeline, casualties, Danjo's final words. The wooden hand became the Legion's holiest relic, displayed only once annually during the Cameroon ceremony. This institutionalization of sacrifice created a self-reinforcing cycle. New recruits joined specifically because of Cameroon's legend. They wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, part of a tradition that valued courage absolutely. The Legion could be selective, choosing men who genuinely embraced the mythology rather than those simply fleeing bad circumstances. The tactical lessons of Cameroon influenced military thinking for decades. European armies studied it intensely, trying to understand how 65 men had held off thousands. The conclusions shaped infantry doctrine through World War I. First, modern rifles in defensive positions created killing zones that numerical superiority couldn't easily overcome. The Minié rifle's 300 to 400-yard effective range meant attackers had to cross extensive open ground under fire. These validated defensive tactics would dominate the Western Front 50 years later. Second, unit cohesion and training could substitute for numbers. The Legionnaires weren't individually superior to Mexican soldiers, but their training was superior, their cohesion was absolute, and their leadership was professional. These factors multiplied their effectiveness beyond what pure numbers suggested. And third, fortifications didn't need to be permanent or elaborate to be effective. The hacienda was barely defensible by engineering standards, but it channeled attacks, provided cover, and gave the defenders the advantage of interior lines. This influenced trench warfare development. Even crude fortifications dramatically enhanced defensive capabilities. Fourth, logistics determined outcomes as much as tactics. The Legionnaires' lack of water proved more deadly than Mexican bullets. Their limited ammunition forced careful fire discipline. Future military planning increasingly emphasized supply lines and logistics as critical determinants of battlefield success. These lessons were tested in subsequent conflicts. The American Civil War's later battles, particularly Petersburg and the fighting around Atlanta, demonstrated that entrenched infantry with modern rifles could resist vastly superior forces. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05 validated defensive firepower's dominance. World War I's trench warfare represented the logical endpoint. Defensive positions became so strong that frontal assaults, regardless of numbers, produced catastrophic casualties. But Cameroon also taught a dangerous lesson, that sacrifice justified itself. that dying well was preferable to surrendering rationally. This cult of offensive spirit, the belief that courage could overcome firepower, led to horrific casualties in World War I. French military doctrine, influenced by Legion mythology, emphasized attack at all costs. The result was millions of casualties in futile offensives against entrenched positions. The Cameron mentality, fight to death rather than surrender, became both the Legion's greatest strength and a source of unsustainable casualties. In Indochina during the 1940s-50s, Legion units repeatedly fought to the death rather than withdraw. Dien Bien Phu, where French forces were surrounded and destroyed by Viet Minh forces in 1954, echoed Cameron, but this time the sacrifice achieved nothing strategically. Modern military psychology views Cameron with ambivalence. Unit cohesion and discipline represent ideal military effectiveness. The refusal to surrender demonstrates exceptional morale. But the actual tactical decisions, particularly continuing to fight after Danju's death when surrender remained available, represent questionable command judgment by modern standards. Today's militaries emphasize mission accomplishment and force preservation. Sacrificing troops in unwinnable positions is considered failure, not heroism. The technology of modern warfare, air support, artillery, armor, means isolated infantry positions can often be relieved or extracted. The calculating, rational surrender Milan offered at 5 a.m. would be the correct choice in current military doctrine. Yet Cameron retains its power. The story resonates because it touches something fundamental about human nature. We admire people who refuse to quit even when quitting is rational. We're moved by sacrifice for comrades even when that sacrifice achieves no strategic objective. We recognize that some human behaviors transcend cost-benefit analysis. The 5 survivors of Cameron lived with their survival in complex ways. Corporal Maine, who negotiated the final surrender terms, served another 15 years but never rose above sergeant major. Fellow legionnaires treated him with respect but also subtle distance. He had survived when 23 had died. The survivor's guilt was profound and permanent. In an 1878 interview with a French military journalist, Maine reflected, "People call us heroes. We weren't heroes. We were trapped men who fought because fighting was all that remained. The heroes died in the courtyard, in the final charge with Captain Danjou. I survived by luck, not virtue. Every April 30th, I stand at the ceremony and remember their faces. I hear Danjou's voice ordering the final charge, and I wonder why I'm standing here while their names are on a monument." Private Wenzel, who deserted in 1865, represents the darker side of Cameron's legacy. In a letter discovered in German archives in the 1970s, he wrote, "They made us into myths when we were just frightened men trying not to die. The Legion uses Cameron to recruit more men for more pointless colonial wars. They'll die as we died, for nothing but a story to recruit the next generation. I'm done being someone's propaganda." The Mexican perspective on Cameron has evolved over 160 years. Initially, it was embarrassing. How could it take all day and heavy casualties to overwhelm 65 men? Mexican military reports minimized the battle's significance and downplayed their own casualties. But as Mexican military professionalism developed in the late 19th century, attitudes shifted. The battle demonstrated that the Mexican army could defeat European forces through persistence and numerical superiority. More importantly, Mexican soldiers' courage under fire, repeatedly assaulting defended positions despite heavy casualties, deserved recognition alongside French courage. The 1892 monument erected at the battlefield represented this reconciliation. Its inscription honored both sides. the French for their extraordinary courage, the Mexicans for their determination and ultimate victory. The annual joint commemorations that began in the 1920s, French Legion Force representatives gathering at Cameroon each April 30th, symbolized mutual respect transcending national rivalry. This shared commemoration is nearly unique in military history. Former enemies rarely jointly celebrate battles, but Cameroon demonstrated something both sides could honor: professional soldiers doing their duty with exceptional courage. The French fought to the death, the Mexicans persisted despite horrific casualties. Both sides displayed military virtue that transcended the conflict's political context. The strategic irrelevance of Cameroon makes its enduring impact more remarkable. The battle changed nothing strategically. The gold convoy that prompted the French patrol never existed. It was false intelligence. The Mexican troops Milan commanded reached Puebla only slightly delayed. The French intervention in Mexico continued for 4 more years before collapsing. The battle's tactical outcome, Mexican victory, French force destroyed, suggested nothing exceptional had occurred. Yet 160 years later, military academies worldwide teach Cameroon. Books, films, and documentaries examine it endlessly. The wooden hand remains one of military history's most recognizable symbols. Why? Because Cameroon represents the eternal tension between rational calculation and human will. Every analysis says the legionnaires should have surrendered. Every calculation proves continued resistance was pointless. But they fought anyway, and in fighting created meaning that transcended strategic relevance. This is why Cameroon resonates in ways that larger, more strategically significant battles don't. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813 involved 600,000 soldiers and decided Napoleon's fate, but it's studied primarily by specialists. Cameroon involved 65 men and changed nothing strategically, but it's known globally. The difference is narrative. Leipzig was about grand strategy and geopolitics. Cameroon was about individual human choice under impossible circumstances. Modern Special Operations Forces, Navy SEALs, SAS, Spetsnaz, study Cameroon not for tactical lessons, but for psychological insights. How do you train small units to maintain cohesion under catastrophic circumstances? How do you create loyalty that survives the collapse of rational hope? How do you make surrender literally unthinkable? The answers involve careful selection, intensive training, and cultural mythology, exactly what the Foreign Legion practiced. Modern special operations selection processes filter for psychological resilience and unit cohesion, similar to Legion standards. Training emphasizes stress inoculation and building trust that endures even in impossible conditions. Unit culture celebrates stories of small teams overcoming overwhelming odds, contemporary Cameroons. The Wooden Hand's annual appearance at Aubaine exemplifies the psychological power of the military ritual. When the Legion's most senior officer removes it from its case and displays it to assembled legionnaires, he's not celebrating a historical battle, he's reaffirming a contract. Serve with absolute commitment, and the Legion will remember you forever. Die for your comrades, and your name will be recited annually for centuries. This transaction, sacrifice in exchange for immortality, is fundamental to military culture. Cameroon perfected it. The 23 dead legionnaires achieved what most humans desperately want: to be remembered, to have their lives mean something, to be part of a story larger than themselves. The Legion offers this explicitly: die well, and we'll remember you forever. The final judgment of Cameroon remains contested. Military historians debate whether Danjo should have surrendered, whether the casualties were justified, and whether the sacrifice achieved anything worth its cost. These are important questions without clear answers. But perhaps they miss the point. Cameroon wasn't about tactical victory or strategic achievement. It was about 65 men, trapped and doomed, choosing how their story would end. They could surrender and live, rational, understandable, correct by any objective standard. Or they could fight and die, irrational, pointless, and immortal. They chose immortality. On April 30th, 1863, in a forgotten hacienda in rural Mexico, mathematical certainty collided with human will. The numbers said surrender. The men said no. For 11 hours, 65 legionnaires demonstrated that courage and discipline could temporarily rewrite the rules of warfare. The Mexican army won the battle. The mathematics proved inevitable. But 160 years later, we remember the names of French legionnaires and debate the meaning of their sacrifice. The Mexican soldiers, equally brave, ultimately victorious, are largely forgotten, except as context for French courage. This might seem unfair. It certainly seems irrational. But it reveals what humans actually value. Not victory or survival, but the choice to fight when fighting is hopeless. Not rational calculation, but commitment that transcends reason. Not living longer, but dying in a way that means something. The wooden hand rests in its case, the Mexican sun rises over Cameroon every morning, and every April 30th, young men from dozens of countries stand at attention and learn that 65 men once held off 10,000. Not because they won, because they refused to lose.